For 3 years, Americans watched egg prices climb to levels nobody thought possible. Now, the USDA says they're about to collapse. But what they're not telling you is why they got this high in the first place. The USDA's Economic Research Service has issued a forecast that stands out among this year's food price predictions. Egg prices are projected to drop between 22 and 27% in 2026, with a possible extreme bound of minus 42%. The numbers are striking, especially after eggs became a symbol of runaway grocery inflation. In January 2025, the national average for a dozen eggs hit $4.95, with shoppers in New York and San Francisco paying as much as $9. Since then, the Consumer Price Index for eggs has fallen 34% year over year, a reversal not seen in any other major grocery category. This projected crash is not a simple story of supply catching up with demand. The ERS model behind the forecast is built on a weighted blend of production volumes, feed costs, and disease scenarios. For 2026, the model assigns 35% of its predictive power to expected egg production, 30% to the cost of feed, mostly corn and soy, and 25% to the assumed impact of highly pathogenic avian influenza, or HPAI. These weights are not arbitrary. They reflect 2 decades of regression analysis linking farm data, disease outbreaks, and retail prices. The model's historical mean absolute error is just over 4%, which means this year's forecast is not a statistical outlier, but it does sit at the edge of the model's own confidence interval. What's missing from the headline is the deeper puzzle. Why did prices climb so high for so long, and why is the drop so sudden now? The ERS forecast does not account for the full context of industry consolidation, the timeline of disease-driven supply shocks, or the legal scrutiny that has begun to reshape how major producers set their prices. The numbers invite a closer look at the forces and incentives that brought the market to this breaking point. In February 2022, the first case of H5N1 was confirmed in a commercial flock, setting off a chain of outbreaks that would devastate the US egg supply. Over the next 3 years, 4 distinct waves of highly pathogenic avian influenza swept through the country. Each wave forced the USDA's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service to order mass culls, with the most severe losses concentrated in late 2024 and early 2025. The D1.1 variant, detected in September 2024, proved especially lethal, driving mortality rates up to 35% in some commercial layer houses. By the end of January 2026, nearly 150 million laying hens had been lost to disease and culling, roughly a third of the national flock. The effects reached every grocery aisle in America. In the worst month, January 2025, 41.4 million hens were destroyed, and the average price for a dozen eggs shot up to $4.95 nationwide. In New York and San Francisco, shoppers faced prices as high as $7 to $9 per dozen. The egg section became a flashpoint for consumer frustration as the cost of a typical grocery basket climbed 40% over the previous year. For millions of households, eggs, once the cheapest protein, became a luxury item. USDA APHIS scrambled to contain the outbreaks, rolling out emergency vaccination programs and biosecurity upgrades, but the pace of losses outstripped any policy response. Meanwhile, consumer sentiment hit a low point. Surveys in January 2026 found that 62% of Americans remain very concerned about food prices, with eggs cited as the most volatile and unpredictable staple. The psychological toll of empty shelves and sticker shock lingered even as the official forecasts began to predict relief. The pain of scarcity and the memory of record prices continue to shape how Americans view the food system's stability and its fragility. Hatchery operators faced a daunting task in the aftermath of the flu waves: restock a national flock gutted by disease, and do it at a pace that could outstrip the next outbreak. Between the spring of 2025 and early 2026, the 3 largest hatcheries, Cal-Maine, Roseacre and Rembrandt, pushed daily chick output up by 22%, moving from 1.5 million to 1.8 million chicks per day. This surge was not just a matter of filling barns, it required a blend of financing, new genetics and technology upgrades. USDA credit guarantees and private equity allowed operators to expand capacity almost overnight. New lines like the Highline W36 and Decalb White, bred for resilience and efficiency, became the industry standard. Inside the barns, precision feeding systems shifted the economics of production. Sensors now monitor feed intake for individual hens, trimming waste by up to 5% and nudging egg output per bird higher. By early 2026, about a third of top-tier farms had adopted these systems, translating small gains into millions of extra eggs. The USDA's Livestock, Dairy and Poultry Outlook projects 117 billion dozen eggs for 2026, still below the pre-crisis peak, but up 2% from the previous year, and enough to saturate a market already bracing for lower prices. For hatchery managers, the math is simple. Every percent of efficiency, every extra chick widens the gap between supply and demand. The recovery is real, but it's also a race, one that rewards scale, speed and ever tighter margins. Federal disaster aid poured into the egg sector as losses mounted, with the USDA dispersing $1.3 billion in direct payments to producers between 2024 and 2025. These funds, intended to stabilize the industry after mass culls, allowed large operators to rebuild flocks at a pace and scale rarely seen. The safety net extended beyond indemnity checks, credit guarantees and feed cost stabilization grants, covered rising expenses as the feed index climbed another 2% in 2025, keeping input costs from erasing potential profits. With financial risk buffered, the largest producers expanded aggressively, filling barns even as inventories began to outpace demand. By early 2026, excess eggs crowded cold storage and weekly inventory reports showed a steady build-up, clear evidence that supply was no longer the constraint. Policy incentives designed to prevent collapse instead deepened the risk of a glut. The result, a market flooded with eggs, prices tumbling and small and mid-sized producers squeezed by both oversupply and falling margins. As government support propped up expansion, the underlying question sharpened: who actually benefits when public funds fuel a surplus, and what happens when the bill comes due? Court records from July 2023 show that Cal-Maine Foods and Roseacre Farms, two of the country's largest egg producers, were hit with a $250 million civil penalty for fixing wholesale prices. The injunction forced both companies to submit to external price monitoring, but the story didn't end there. While shelves were empty and families faced sticker shock, the top producers posted their highest margins in years. Cal-Maine's operating margin climbed from 17% in 2021 to 22% in 2024, while Roseacres reached 23%. Quarterly filings detail how these firms turned record retail prices into windfall profits, even as costs from disease and feed rose only modestly by comparison. Executive compensation packages ballooned, with bonuses tied directly to average egg prices, staying above $4.50 per dozen. The legal record, including documented email exchanges and board meeting notes, revealed a coordinated effort to keep prices high by setting minimum wholesale rates, a violation of antitrust law. This pattern of profit-taking continued until the Department of Justice launched a wider antitrust probe in March 2025, raising the stakes for the industry's biggest players and casting doubt on the idea that the price crash was simply a matter of supply and demand correcting itself. Federal scrutiny landed squarely on the egg industry in March 2025, when the Department of Justice Antitrust Division opened a sweeping investigation into the top 5 producers: Cal-Maine Foods, Roseacre Farms, Rembrandt, Hillendale and Rose Hill. Together controlled about 55% of the national laying hen inventory. Cal-Maine alone accounted for 1 in 5 eggs sold in the US, with over 40 million hens across its network. DOJ subpoenas targeted internal communications, pricing algorithms, and exclusive supply contracts, probing whether these giants had divided markets or coordinated supply to keep prices high. The timing was not lost on analysts. Within weeks of the investigation's announcement, wholesale egg prices began to unravel, falling sharply after 3 years of relentless increases. Market data from the summer of 2025 shows inventories swelling as producers, wary of antitrust penalties, rushed to offload surplus eggs rather than risk accusations of price fixing or territory allocation. The numbers are stark. By early 2026, the top 5 firms' share of production had stabilized, but their pricing power was under unprecedented pressure. The DOJ's intervention did not just threaten civil penalties, it broke the spell of coordinated restraint, forcing a return to competitive pricing just as oversupply hit its peak. For the first time in years, downward movement in egg prices could not be explained by feed costs or disease alone. The legal environment had become a market force in its own right. Eggs may soon cost less, but the forces that drove prices to record highs, disease, consolidation, and profit incentives remain unchecked. Even as the USDA forecasts a 22% drop, 62% of Americans still worry about affording groceries. Lower prices today don't mean a safer food system tomorrow.